Okay. Hello, and welcome to our webinar today. This is the second in a series of 3 webinars that deal with trying to train teachers or help teachers infuse systems thinking and system dynamics modeling into their curriculum at the pre-college level. The first one was on pre-service teachers and how some professors are adding systems thinking to their pre-service training for teachers. Today is on in-service teachers, giving presentations and workshops to in-service teachers. And in 2 months, it will be on mentoring, helping teachers who have decided that they want to bring this into the classroom actually get started bringing it into the classroom. I am, so that I don't go off on too many stories and keep myself to as close to my 15 minutes as possible, I am going to read the transcript that I have for each slide, turn off my video, and read the transcript that I have for each slide so that I can share the information I want to share in an as efficient way as possible. We have 3 speakers here. I will focus on high school, primarily secondary school training of teachers. Alan Tukotsky will focus primarily on middle school training of teachers, and Sherry Marlin will focus primarily on primary school, perhaps kindergarten. I don't know, I haven't asked her about that, but focused on primary school. And she's done a lot of work with the group in Turkey, which got them off to a wonderful start. So if you will allow me, I will get this off the ground and I will turn off my video and I will turn on my screen sharing and get started. Let's see. Hello, my name is Diana Fisher. I was a secondary school mathematics and science teacher for most of my career. In the last 2 decades of my career, I used modeling of dynamic feedback systems, that is, system dynamics, in my classes, and it had a highly transformative impact on my students and my classes and on me as a teacher and a person. During my high school teaching and after I retired, I gave and still give many presentations and workshops to secondary school and university mathematics and science teachers to help them learn to use system dynamics in their instruction, with the emphasis on having students build system models on the computer. I would like to share with you some of the insights I have learned in this process. Often, teachers or instructors will indicate at least one major concern regarding bringing a new idea into their instruction. The paramount concern I hear is, my curriculum is too full already. The response to that is to have an example prepared in advance that takes a dynamic problem or concept that is in their curriculum and allows you to show how system dynamics can make the problem more understandable. It is very helpful if you have a potential lesson or lesson ideas appropriate for the level of student that is active and inclusive, that is student-centered. The connection to the teacher's curriculum must be explicit at the beginning. In mathematics and science, it's very important to show students how to build stock flow models. These 2 disciplines make the importance of learning to represent dynamic problems using modeling a foundational skill. In math, it's usually modeling by writing equations. In science, it's building replicas of physical devices or experimenting with processes in the lab to understand connections and rates of change. To infuse systems thinking, especially in mathematics and science classes at the secondary school level, access to stock flow modeling software is extremely important. Most K-12 educators who use or have their students build system dynamics models use the Stella modeling software. I explain each modeling icon and what that does. For this audience, I don't have to actually do this explanation. I strongly believe that system dynamics modeling is an essential tool that all mathematics students, at least at the secondary school level, should learn. The point of mathematics education is to provide our students with the tools to better analyze the problems they encounter in their world. The world is full of dynamic feedback systems, yet we do not provide our secondary school students with the tools to analyze these systems. This is a huge mistake, one we should remedy immediately, and we can. Let's start with a very simple pattern of behavior, linear behavior. To help students understand linear change over time, I use a motion detector. A motion detector is a device that sends out a sonar pulse that bounces off an object in front of it. It times the return pulse and calculates the distance of the object from the device. The distance can be plotted on a graph. The device can be connected to a computer with a projector, and the graph can be displayed on an overhead screen. Assume the motion detector is placed on a chair and the student is asked to stand a half a meter away from it. The student is directed to walk away from the motion detector at a slow, steady, constant pace. Before the person moved, I asked the students to sketch what they thought the graph of the person's distance from the motion detector should look like on the axis that is, I usually provide them on a handout. Notice that the graph of the position of the person moving backwards at a constant steady pace produces a straight line. We repeat this experiment with a student requested to walk away from the detector at a quick, steady pace. How will the graph be the same? How will it be different? This helps the student connect the position of the moving person to the velocity of the person, both described by the straight line produced. For middle school students, another kinesthetic lesson can be very helpful. In this lesson, a stock shape with an inflow and an outflow is created using masking tape on the floor of the classroom, large enough for students to walk in and out via the flows. Different scenarios are presented, and the number of students in the stock are recorded on a set of axes on the board using sticky dots or a marker. These students could represent animals entering and leaving an ecosystem or people migrating to and from a country. After using the motion detector, then the stock flow representation for the person's movement can be captured, numbers entered in each icon, and a graph created to show the behavior is linear. Later, another example of linear growth could be considered like water flowing into a lake from streams. Since we assume the stream water is entering the lake at a steady, constant rate, the total water in the lake is increasing in a linear fashion. It is important to explain to the audience how the software is keeping track of the values in the model and calculating new values as it executes the model. I display a stock flow model I just explained, but with values this time. I indicate that the graph of the stock will be linear. I show the values of the stock, how they are updated via equations behind the scene. Then I show the math equation for this scenario to connect the new stock flow representation to the traditional equation representation. I always show both math and science instructors the details of a linear and exponential system dynamics model. I like to develop the stock flow diagram for a money in the bank problem because almost all the audience will understand the need for the connections from the stock to the flow and from an interest fraction to the flow developed as part of the discussion. At this time, I also introduce the concept of feedback. Then it is useful to mention that all exponential functions have flows whose value is proportional to the stock. A little calculus idea I like to implant at this time. Again, I show how the software works for this model, showing the previous exponential model with values in each icon. Almost all adults know the graph that would be produced. How the software calculates new values for the stock is explained. It is important to show both the yearly compounding exponential equation and the continuous compounding exponential equation to the teachers. The stock flow diagram is the same, but the model settings are different. This caused me some problems when I was just starting to learn system dynamics. This slide displays the modeling window of the free Stella Online software, which I always show to my audience. See the URL at the bottom of the screen. I can't see it, but hopefully you can. The stock flow diagram, oh, sorry about that, which I always show to my audience. See the URL at the bottom of the screen to locate the site that allows you to log in to the software. I always build an exponential model in Stella Online for the audience so they can see how easy the process of building the model is. I found this very important, and I do it right after I have explained the exponential model. Here are some topics I have used for students to create system dynamic models in second-year algebra. Notice that the focus is on different types of functions to support the function focus of second-year algebra. Notice that I also sometimes have students combine functions or experiment with new functions to show them more interesting problems. Listed here are my suggestions to teachers to give them an idea of a system dynamics lesson progression they could eventually follow if they wanted students to build system dynamics in their math classes. Use hands-on lessons to help students learn the behavior of the system. Have students follow guided model building lessons. Have students translate between the equation representation and the stock flow representation. That's for math students only, and only when you're using single function models. Have students anticipate the model behavior graphically and explain the discrepancies between the predicted and computer graphs. Have students test alternate story scenarios, what ifs, for the model, explaining the results. Or George Richardson says he has his students just copy models at the beginning. I have always used the guided model building lesson. Have students extend a core model that operates correctly. Have students explain how feedback controls dynamics eventually. I don't do it right away at the beginning, but I do it eventually. Use system dynamics throughout the year, eventually. You can't do that when you're just getting started. But eventually you want this to be shown to students as a tool for thinking and not just for a 2-week project. Have students build small original models, usually kept to just 2 stocks, once the teacher has built up some confidence in debugging models. System dynamics models provide a new representation for some core functions studied in algebra. This representation is more visual for the functions, and the new representation is based on the rates of change for each function, a very important concept in calculus. The structure or blueprint for each function helps describe why the function behavior makes sense. That is, constant flows create linear stock behavior, proportional flows create exponential stock behavior, etc. Since system dynamics model icons use full words or phrases in their names, it's easier for students to remember what each part of the model represents. And it has been my experience with students that they have a much easier time translating word problems that describe dynamic situations to the stock flow model structure. Take, for example, the representation of an oscillating spring behavior. The stock flow diagram captures the concepts of position, restoring force, mass, acceleration, velocity, etc., all central concepts in the dynamic of a bouncing spring. The closed form equation merely captures the appearance of the oscillation, not the core structure that is causing the behavior to occur. I believe that the stock flow structure is more educationally valuable than the closed form equation. Students and many adults are notoriously poor at reading and interpreting graph. System dynamics has as one of its main analytical techniques to interpret the graphical output of the models multiple times as the models are built, modified, and tested. Students get lots of practice reading and interpreting graphs. Moreover, students are often required to view flow graphs on the same grid as stock graphs to help explain the stock behavior. This correlational graphical analysis is a core concept in calculus and very important for understanding dynamic phenomenon. Students can develop this understanding. Oops, I went too far there. Students can develop this understanding before learning calculus. Creating the stock flow diagram displays the student's mental model. The student can test his or her mental model to determine if the structure produces reasonable results. Then, if it does not, the student knows that he or she must modify the model structure via more research that often includes communicating with other team members to improve the model and obtain reasonable results. Building useful and interesting models using system dynamics modeling can allow students to study problems that would be out of their reach using only closed form equations. The most receptive teachers to the idea of infusing system dynamics modeling in their classes will be science teachers. They are usually not afraid of math, and they already use simulations in their teaching almost all of the time. Listed here are some of the science subdisciplines for which system dynamics is a natural fit. Here are some examples of models within the environmental science discipline that are useful initial models. Here are some examples of models within biology that are useful initial models. Some examples of models that have been used in human physiology secondary school classes are listed here. There are so many system dynamics models that can be used to help students with physics concepts. Here are some models that can be used in earth and space science classes. I would like to provide you with my recommendations for doing presentations or workshops for secondary school teachers. In a presentation, at least show how to build an exponential model in the free software. Be sure to use the highlight features of your browser, a larger cursor, and a highlighter. Workshops are better than just presentations because teachers need hands-on experience. However, presentations followed by workshops are the best. You have to understand the school and classroom environment. Know the constraints on time and content for teachers. Know the language of the subject and the curriculum. Present with a teacher if you are not a teacher, if possible. Recommend teachers start with small groups of students to practice their first system dynamics model building lesson. Suggest that the teacher has a lesson handout for at least the first system dynamics full class lesson, because some students will actually read directions. Students are going to pick this up very fast. Use them as aids for future lessons and keep the models simple. I will show you some resources available for obtaining the Stella software and books of lessons. Most importantly, all K-12 school systems can apply for a free site license of the Stella professional online modeling software. It does not have the restrictions of the regular Stella online software and is still web-based. This slide shows the person to contact at IC Systems to request this license. You might want to take a snapshot of this slide. IC Systems also has a couple of books of lessons for teaching system dynamics in secondary and tertiary algebra and calculus classes, and also for teaching a 9-month-long system dynamics modeling course, as well as many free simulations, not curated, so check who the authors are, that are available at exchange.icsystems.com. The Creative Learning Exchange has many books of system dynamics lessons for teachers of primary through secondary school. And Alan, our second speaker, wrote The Shape of Change with Rob Quaden, and also wrote What Now? A Call to Action. Excellent books that you will find at the Creative Learning Exchange. CC Modeling Systems is my website, and it gives access to many stock flow diagrams of original models created by my secondary school students and their papers explaining the models. Also, there are some free lessons that can be downloaded. I offer 3 online system dynamics modeling courses, providing a general introduction to system dynamics modeling each summer. They are asynchronous and each lasts 10 weeks. And there are some documents that align the value of system dynamics with some of the national education standards in the United States. The System Dynamics Society has a pre-college webpage with more resources for information that contains the recordings of all of our webinars and special interest group meeting conversations. It contains some free lessons, books, and models with more to come. Many of these resources are translated from the exceptional work done by the Systems Thinking Association in Turkey. There is a free model building software, Model Builder, that helps teachers and students create stock flow diagrams, but not simulations. There is another free system dynamics modeling software called Sage Modeler, with some free lessons and models that middle school and secondary school teachers may find useful. One of the biggest problems we have is finding access to secondary school teachers. Teachers' conferences work, but more access is needed. Thank you. Okay.
Get yourself a glass of water, Diana.
You're muted, Diana.
Diana, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Diana, you're muted.
You're muted.
Oh, okay. So you didn't need to hear any of that anyway. We have our next speaker, who is Alan Tukotsky, and he has a lot of experience training middle school and actually upper elementary school teachers. And please, Alan, why don't you start?
Thanks. Let me share my screen. Okay. Thanks. All right. Thank you, Diana. Yeah, so first I'd like to say that I've been retired for a few years, so I hope that these resources are still helpful to everybody. And if anything goes by too fast, you can certainly look at the recordings that are being done of this. Feel free to use anything that's in here, and especially if it's needed to be translated, go for it. There are some axiomatic things that I keep track of here, and I think Diana covered a bunch of them. The system tools that we teach support curriculum. They're not just to be used all by themselves. So everybody who's at full capacity then can still use them, and we try to make the point that everybody would like to be more efficient if possible. Teachers often say, give me something I can use in my classroom. So if you're a person who's introducing people to system dynamics, try to have some stuff that teachers can take right home and use in their classroom. And if it's a really good tool, I know from my experience as a teacher and all my colleagues, something that's useful becomes part of your repertoire, and then you can use it. And finally, I want to say that visual tools are sometimes overlooked in schools, and the more access we can give students to visual tools as well, the better off I think they'll be. Here are some of the big ideas that I try and get across. There are a lot of big ideas, certainly. I don't have to tell this audience, but these 4 are certainly ones that I like teachers to keep in the forefront when they're thinking about systems thinking and system dynamics. Generally, I will divide the tools into 3 big major categories, knowing that different people are going to be responding more strongly to different in different ways. So generally, I also try to make the point that all of the tools are going to cover the same territory of those big ideas that we just showed. This one I won't read for you, but if you've had the same experience as I, the people who are already teaching in a learner-centered learning way are often, just very, very fertile ground for starting systems as well. And all of those little bubbles there are quite important, I think, to teaching systems. When I say this learner-centered learning, I'm contrasting it to a lecture format where the teacher stands at the front of the class and informs kids about what they want them to learn. There are a lot of schemes about characteristics of a systems thinker. This is just one that I've used in workshops, things that systems thinkers do that improve, I think, their understanding of complexity and difficult situations. So on to the activities. For behavior over time graphs, I think that's usually for especially middle school age teachers, the easiest door for them to enter systems. And I use the 4-question scheme to give them an idea of what is important about behavior over time graphs. What's changing? What's the variable that's important enough to graph? How is it changing? Is it growing? What's the shape of the line? Is it going down? Is it flat or whatever? Why is it changing? What are the reasons that this is an important variable that you're studying? What's going on? What are the reasons? What's the background? And finally, a so what, or as I took for the title of my book and blog, now what? What's the important part of this? A good way to start, everybody loves the weather, and so I'm sorry for the low definition of this. This is just a photograph that I took out of the newspaper, but it's a wonderful graph full of information. I live about maybe 15 or 20 miles in a direct line from the airport in Boston, and this is where the weather comes from. And there's all kinds of interesting things to point out there. And just, every year when we would talk about this, you could see some very, very strange, unusual things happening. So in February, for example, there was a record low temperature and a record high temperature, which were separated by a smaller increment than a week. So anyway, there's a lot to talk about there. Stories to graphs is an activity that my colleague Rob and I used to use a lot. We would make up a story and ask the participants to graph the stories. And here are 5 that you can take a quick look at. First one's about prices. The second one is the noise at the end of a performance and the levels that it goes to. Third one is about the growing of grass. I know not everybody lives in the same kind of temperate climate where grass grows, but usually there's some kind of plant that you can keep track of how it grows. Fourth one is about the assembly of a jigsaw puzzle and the speed with which the pieces come together. If you graph how many pieces there are connected, we've all had that experience of it not being a linear graph. And finally, almost every workshop will have some folks who like sports. And so if you keep track of the number of games that your sports team wins, we did that. I don't know, people familiar here in Boston, the baseball team here was famous, the Red Sox, for breaking everybody's heart, having a fast start, and then doing more poorly toward the end. So it was kind of a bittersweet joke in a workshop in Boston, but in other places you get to hear what the local teams are. After that, we would ask people to try to have a lot of conversation, because these are generally interesting topics. We'd ask folks to choose and go back to either one graph, or if we had enough time, multiple graphs, and add a second line to the graph pad. And then we could continue the conversation. What are the relationships among the lines that you have? Are they coincidental? Are they complementary? Are they causal? Are they correlated in any way? What's going on? We had the experience of an 8th grade teacher whom we worked with, who was a science teacher, and he found that adding a second line to a graph after a lab really increased the students' understanding of what was going on. Now, the opposite of doing that, the graphs to stories, is presenting. These are the 4 that we would often use. The kind of archetypal graphs that systems models produce: the exponential decay, the exponential growth, the goal seeking, and overshoot and collapse. So there we would present these and say, what are instances in which you're familiar with behaviors like this? It's a little harder for most people, we find, to do it that way. On to feedback here. You notice that I'm using a plus and the letters. I always try to teach people to use the polarity signs, plus for the same direction and a minus for the opposite. But in middle school, sometimes that really messes up kids. When they see a plus, they assume that it means a growth in the second variable. So, we would always say to people, certainly use S and O for opposite if that's easy. So this is a pretty easy one, more population, more births, and births increase population. This one is more problematic, and so we would stay away from this, because those of you who know George Richardson, he's written a really clear paper about why this doesn't work so well. If population goes down, then deaths tend to go down. They move in the same direction. But when deaths go down, population moves in an opposite way. It doesn't really mean population goes up. Deaths don't make population go up. It may make population change in a way so that it's decreasing at less of a rate. But that's kind of complicated, especially in a beginning workshop. So a more clear balancing loop that I always had a lot of success with was using a thermostatic, example that shows the goal seeking. If you're in a cold environment, your furnace heats up your building, and if the building gets warm enough, then the furnace turns off, and as the furnace turns off, then the heat eventually escapes, and the gap grows again, and the furnace goes on. Now, this was a really interesting one, where we learned that the causal loops that surface people's mental models are not always universal. So here, let's say that you're practicing music or an athletic skill or something. So generally, the more you have an incentive to practice, the more you will practice, and the more you practice, the better you become. So in our school, when we were doing this in our middle school in Massachusetts, the students were offered the opportunity to have no-cost music lessons. They might need to rent a musical instrument. So a lot of the kids, more than 50% of the kids, were practicing music either through the school or privately. So we would come in, and this happened to us twice before we wised up. that we'd bring this loop around thinking it's going to be an easy reinforcing loop. Yeah, you have an incentive practice, you get better, the music sounds good, you say, boy, I want to learn some better songs or some songs really sounding good. But some of the kids would say, no, I don't see it that way. When my skill gets better, I don't have to practice as much because my parents and my music teacher don't push me. They get off my back and I don't have to work as hard. But it is balancing, because if you don't practice, your skills start to erode, and then your parents and the music teacher will again be on your case to work harder. So there's a way that we would bring that up and say, you know, this causal loops are a good way to surface a mental model. This one, if you use connection circles, this is just the version that we've had either at the Creative Learning Exchange or in our publications. So again, I won't go through this right now, but if you wanted to take that slide, certainly feel free to use it when you go back. We had a lot of good luck in our first publishing of The Shape of Change and talking about McDonald's, one of the United States big exports here. And so when the more French fries get sold by McDonald's, they're very tasty and popular, McDonald's would have high profits. The number of restaurants could expand, and then more French fries would be sold. So there's a connection circle that we find a loop inside there. There's another one, however, the more French fries that are sold, the more that are eaten, the more fat is consumed by the people eating them. And that brings up concerns about health. And then people have to make a decision about, you know, do they keep buying and eating the French fries? And so you pull out those two loops and you have a balancing loop with health, possibly a balancing loop, depending on people's decisions about their eating habits. And then the profit loop over there on the left. And since they share an element, you can put them together and you can have the conversation about loop dominance that happens in these complex systems. Here's moving on to the stock flows, a simple one, the water in the bathtub one that we all have seen. And it's not a whole lot of insight maybe, but a fifth grade teacher drew this and started using it with her students to show how that Stella generated water in a bathtub stock flow diagram is replicated there by a real one. You could also talk about what the clouds mean. You know, she would say, I'm not putting in where the water is coming from, whether it's well water or, you know, municipal water. And we're not showing what happens to the water when it goes down the drain. Those are all important things, but they're not what we're modeling here right now. So she would pass that worksheet out when she was having kids identify stocks and flows and have them write on the bathtub and on the pipes until you know, they were ready to move to the more abstract diagram. And here's one that's a little more insight. It's a, you know, certainly existential world problem. And you could use the stock flows like that to tell a story. I see Brad was in the audience. He helped us understand here how to expand this one to show that we burn the carbon fuel, and those emissions then are produced that add to the atmosphere. And the CO2 in the atmosphere here ends up being a blanket to stop heat from radiating out to space. We also would bring up with the teachers, you know, you can mention to the kids, this is not a closed loop. And, you know, we're hoping that some of us, that the more the heat builds up in the atmosphere, that might feed back over here to us doing something about burning carbon-based fuel. Then this is the loop I showed a while back about the heat in the house and the furnace and so on. This is another good way to show where the math is done by converters. This is a way to show a simple stock flow diagram that not only has stocks and flows, but also converters. And this one here is for the physics teachers. We always try to make sure that we're not equating heat and temperature. So we have a, converter to change the heat into degrees. And then the gap here compares the amount of heat that's in the house to the amount of heat that's measured by a thermostat. The alcohol model that we used in school was very effective. We used it with 8th graders, and the health teacher really liked it, and other schools have had good results with it. You notice that inside some of the parts of the model, there are places where kids can put in their own values, their gender, their weight, and the amount of drinks per hour, and so on. And in this initial one, we started with just this sort of flow sitting out here by itself, which is a little strange. And we talked with the kids and tried to do it in front of them, as Diana was saying. If you can do a demonstration, we said, what might reflex action affect? And the kids talked about that if they're with somebody who's impaired and they're driving, how long does it take them to put their foot down on the brake if some obstacle comes, or another car or a human or something in front of them? And after kids would work on this, they would see that it wasn't just a bunch of teachers standing up in front of the class saying don't drink. We're saying scientifically, here's what happens to your blood level if you drink alcohol at a certain rate, and here's what happens to your reflex action. So that's what might happen if you or somebody else got behind the wheel of a car. And here are some quotes from kids. Now, some of these are from 8th grade, which is the top of middle school generally in the United States. A few of them, I think, may come from high school. I did work with high school kids the last 7 years or so of my career. So we have 2 pages of those. And I like down near the bottom when the student said it would be helpful if the computers were faster. Well, they are faster than when we first started doing this. And but mostly the kids were quite impressed with the model and really liked it. And thanks.
Thank you very much, Alan. That's great. Really appreciate your insights and your willingness to share those with us. So now to Sherry. Sherry, please go ahead and share your slides.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you guys. So definitely I'm with the Water Center for Systems Thinking, and our practice has been very informed by both Diana and Al, and I think you'll hear that through this presentation. And I really want us to think a little bit about, so what are some of the lessons that we have learned from early childhood that definitely influence our work with students, with teachers, and all the adults that we teach. And we often start in that fundamental place about the fact that we are all living in systems. They are all around us. We're embedded in systems, right from Danella Meadows' work about the characteristics of systems, and for students to recognize that their own classrooms, whether that's a preschool classroom or a high school classroom, or a team at work, it's all about those interconnections and the parts and the relationships between those parts that make up a system. Again, I know many of you, and I know you're familiar with the Water Center, but the habits are also fundamental to our work with all ages in building systems thinking capacity, because it's that idea that, and I do believe that some of the habits are instinctive from birth. If you think about how a child learns to speak, they start with some syllables that don't really sound like anything. And when those syllables start to sound like words like mama or daddy or water, they get a ton of reinforcement. And then they continue to grow so that they're getting reinforcement feedback from the very beginning. So there's a QR code. If you're not familiar with their habits, they're available in multiple languages. I will also say that in dealing with young children, we tried at the Water Center to make them a little more kid-friendly or to change the language. You really can't. And I was actually working in a primary school and we tried to do that. A skillful teacher can scaffold the language of leverage and connection for the young, and we are working with 3s and 4s, and they can use those terms. And they say to us, if you used some substitute term, we'd use that, but you use leverage, we understand it. So the habits are definitely a backbone of that piece. So and again, I've been with the Water Center for over 15 years and doing this work longer than that. We are always asking when we're working with young children and their teachers, is this truly developmentally appropriate? Are we infusing our thinking, our way of doing things? Or are children doing it? And this is one of my favorite pictures. This shows Al. I do not live in one of those places where grass grows. That's the playground, dirt and rocks. But the students were out in those dirt and rocks drawing graphs. And then you see them adding, and when we see them take the tools and habits of systems thinking and apply it to their play, or when during a lesson, students will ask, may I use this tool because it helps me make sense? We know that we are on a path where the systems thinking is supporting the children's thinking and learning, and it's not something that we're doing to them. So we don't necessarily, as Al said, start with accumulation, but we definitely do stock and flow. We use that language with the youngest children. This happens to be a kindergarten classroom. And I put that in because what is an accumulation? Well, a stock pot full of soup is an accumulation. And so this became a very popular lesson in that these students would, make soup and they'd read stone soup and they would add things to their soup. So all those little pieces of paper are the different ingredients, and students like different vegetables of different colors. So they were getting a little bit of scale, proportion, and quantity in there. But a very concrete way to enter stock flow. This is still one of my favorites because, again, it shows developmental understanding. This little guy, Deshaun, that is the graph of the soup. So you saw them putting the ingredients in. The straight line right there at the top is the soup cooking, and then they serve the soup. And this little guy raised his hand and he said to me, that graph is wrong. I said, tell me why. He goes, because that line when the soup is cooking shouldn't be straight. Now you need to know that this was not a 5-year-old that one would have thought was at the top of the class. This was a 5-year-old that was in trouble. That's why he'd been sitting at the back of the room to watch the soup cook. And he said there was stuff. He didn't have the vocabulary team. He said there was stuff coming off, and that's the amount of soup was decreasing. That line shouldn't be straight. And so when he said that to me again, that reaffirmed that this tool was helping him have a deeper understanding of his environment and the systems that were impacting him. And it gave him skills to be able to communicate that understanding. So this is this is a preschool, a Head Start class in Kentucky. And again, you just sort of see the progression. So you're probably familiar with the song about the monkeys jumping on the bed. 10 little monkeys jumping off the bed. Okay, so one jumps off, bumps it. Well, okay, that is an accumulation. So you see the teacher reading the book, you see them using manipulatives in order to tell that story, to adapt that story in different ways, doing it in groups so that they can eventually move. And you'll see many examples of these. Another one, I know an old lady who swallowed a fly. And this happens to be, and I know an old lady who swallowed a snowman. And if you do any time, if your own kids, there's 10 bazillion versions of that book. But this teacher made an old lady and with her middle open so that students could put things in and things could come out. So very visual, very experiential, and very able to use the graph to tell that story. So they're using the graph embedded in the stock flow. Now, again, when we teach adults, sometimes we have to tell them more than once that that stock can be represented by a graph. So for our youngest children, they're immediately making the connection between the graph and the accumulation in the stock. This is another one that you may have seen, but the idea of garden health, and I'll spend a little more time on this example because, again, this is one that has translated into a number of schools in a number of places. You see the students out with the garden, and I wish this picture were better, but on the bottom right, that photograph is in the garden. And on the sidewalk at this school, they have a stock flow drawn, painted onto the sidewalk where they talk about their garden health. And the converters for that are on little flat rocks. So again, students can move those converters around. They can draw on this side with chalk in order to make connections between those, but they're using the stock flow in the actual place where they are to better understand it. This is an adult drawing of a capturing of something that was happening, but this was the preschool class that you saw in the top left. They talked about their garden health, what adds to gardens growing and what takes away from their growing. And again, you can just see that it's the students' language. It's the children using the tool to make sense of their world, putting the flowers in, and the little hashtags in the boundaries and the clouds of the system came to represent the fence, because bunnies were a big problem, and they were in, like, the garden would grow and then the bunnies would eat their garden. And one of our favorite stories, one child said, oh, those bunnies, those are the clouds. Those where those bunnies go when they get when they go away and they no longer affect the growing of the garden. So this is another children's book, Muncha Muncha by Candace Fleming, if you're familiar with that story. This particular farmer has a huge problem with bunnies eating his garden. So this is focused on the farmer's happiness as he's able to grow the garden and as the bunnies eat his plant, and that definitely takes away from his happiness. So connecting a fictional story to an experience, again, builds that. Now you'll notice that many of these examples, and these are all preschool examples, don't have that critical piece of how does the stock affect the converters. So that is something we work with. That's something we have to work with teachers on, getting them comfortable. But you will see that eventually they get them. Here's another one that really, I love this one because it was so kinesthetic. This is, several of these now are going to be from what we in the US would call an exceptional education preschool classroom. Preschool is required for students who have an identified learning need at 3 or before. And so these are not necessarily integrated classes. They're classes that meet these developmental needs. That's why you see a lot of photos of what we call board maker, because students don't have the language. And what these teachers love about the habits and tools of systems thinking is that the visual nature of the tools helps the students have language. It gives voice to the thinking that they're doing, which is very on keeping with their age-appropriate peers. Just checking my time there. But they're able to use the tools to explain those things. So this rain starts with them actually doing a little like fingers tapping on the table, and the fingers get faster and they get louder as the storm comes, and then the storm goes away. So telling that story, acting that story out, and using the tools to make it visual. Diana mentioned this one about tape on the floor. So going to the zoo, people in, people out, students can act out that story. They can do it repetitively. Works with 3 to 5-year-olds just as it does with high school students. This one was fun. This is a board maker illustration. The same schools that have gardens often have chickens. And I just love some of these. So this one is what helps the chickens care is getting rid of the poop. And I included this one so you see like the shovel and the rake, like what are the tools? So you're beginning to see connections within the connectors. So they're getting more complex, even though still missing that critical feedback piece. Protecting the chickens. What are you having to protect them from? And then, the broken cages. So again, all these generated by students. This is a very old photo, but I just, knowing that many of you have seen this one, it goes way back to the water holes, some work we even did with our colleagues in the Netherlands. We've, made these fancier, but there's something about young children doing this kinesthetically, retelling that story, pouring the water in as the inflow, turning it, the drain, it's a simple faucet spout like you would use on your hose in order to control the inflow and the outflow. And if you're not familiar with the story, the water hole dries up, and then as more animals drink, more animals come, the water goes down, all the water's gone, all the animals go, the rain comes, the animals come back. So again, very tangible way for kids to see that. And then this is a time when students really began to make those connections. So a two-stalk system, water in the water in the hole, the animals in the stalk. So all of these examples just underscore that we've worked very hard to make this concrete, experiential, kinesthetic, physical, and visual. And as I was preparing, then I stopped and thought, but isn't that what a stock flow model does for adults? And like Diana said, it makes those equations that we all memorize, we get a picture of them. And so introducing them to young students and their teachers is not that different than really the fundamental purpose of a stock flow, to help us see a system, to be able to anticipate things that may happen and be better prepared for those. It's also very supporting of integration. And we talk about integrating in schools, but the concepts, disciplines, how do you bring together the different sciences, physics, chemistry, biology? Again, in the US, we tend to teach them very isolated, but how much more meaning can be gained when it's integrated? And when teachers are doing models and simulations, that happens very automatically. And if students leave us with the ability to integrate ideas, how much more prepared they are. So there's that how many monkeys jumping on the bed classrooms, where you see the iceberg, the ladder of inference, the behavior over time graphs, all permanently on that board. So students are always making that connections and those integrations together. So here, and this is a fascinating one about this graph of the farmer's exasperation is not spoken of in the text of the story. It's quickly, you can only see the farmer getting more exasperated by his shadow. So students, this was in non-English speakers in an English-speaking classroom, did this graph based just on the pictures. But then also, so that's the farmer. Again, in this story, the cow's perspective really matters. And so they use the ladder of inference to expose the mental model of the cow versus the farmer, and different tools to do that. If you smile at a friend, they'll smile back at you. Happiness goes round and round, reinforcing feedback. And this one, the more I include people, the more people will include me. It makes me want to include others more. So the loops are a way for students to really understand behavior and to share that behavior, which left me to the thought I want to leave you with, is that I think this is one of the biggest lessons that we need to take from our work at early childhood, is the more trust we put in the capacity of the learner, the more learning is going to happen. And the more learning happens, the more we as the teacher facilitator that reading are able to step back and trust in the capacity of the learner. So those are some lessons we have learned about systems thinking in preschool and early elementary.
Thank you very much, Sherry. That was a really nice presentation, and I think it gave us all a lot of information and some books to read to our grandkids. So that's great. Yeah, stories are a wonderful way to start this at every level. So thank you very much. Now, I know the time is over, but we're going to stay. Those of you who can stay, we invite you to stay. We're going to continue the conversation and answer any questions you have. We know that if you have to leave, please feel free to leave. But the video will be, the recording will be posted on the System Dynamics Society Pre-College SIG webpage. And so you can go back and watch it, and it will be with the separation on the, no, I don't think, do we separate? We don't separate the conversation. I think it's all there at one time. So do we have any questions from any of the people who have presented? We'd like to invite you to ask any questions you would like to ask. Okay, Steve?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you to all of you. And what wonderful presentations. Um, yeah, I actually have a number of questions, but I'm going to stick to one. Um, I Many of you know me as well. I've done a lot of this through my career as a high school teacher. My wife is a preschool teacher, and it's always amazed me how the kids she worked with are always so engaged and excited about what they're doing. And when they get to high school, and we've had many, many conversations about how jaded they become, and they don't want to do the work, and they just want to go look at their phones, and all of this kind of horrible stuff that happens when they get just kind of out of middle school and into high school. And I wonder if the three of you could just speak to tips, tricks that you might have for engaging students who are not necessarily desiring to be engaged.
I'll answer that one because we have a lot of conversation about that. And I do think in some way it goes back to the habits. So the particular primary school where I had the work opportunity to do a lot of this work, then the students would go to um, classes and teachers that didn't necessarily have any systems thinking background. And parents would come back to us and say, my third grader is so frustrated because he doesn't think his teachers really value his thinking anymore. So I think there's a huge lesson in that for how do we keep kids engaged? We make it more about their thinking than the content that we're trying to teach them. And I think that's a principle that would apply across all ages.
I would say also that the active classroom, the more active a classroom you can have, the more engaged kids will be. And you know, school is really a very social time for kids, especially in middle school. I know that. And I taught in a fairly spread out town in Massachusetts, and the kids' social lives really were based on the school. Their neighborhoods were often kind of rural, so when they came to school, they wanted to talk with each other and hang out. And so when we had lessons where they did group problem solving, I think they appreciated that as well.
I think variety is really important. Not doing the same thing every day, and the kinesthetic activities are especially important, especially in math, at the high school level, because often we just have kids sit at their desks and do mathematics work, or sometimes they're able to get in groups. But the motion detector, believe it or not, I had a student in an Algebra 1 class who was not very responsive, but he really shone when it came to the motion detector. And he loved that piece because he was a very physical kid and he liked being able to shine. So I think variety is a big deal. Giving students a way to understand math that's not stuck to equations is also a big deal because equations are really, really abstract. And I noticed with the students who were not very good in algebra, really liked the stock flow diagramming piece with the words all over the place because it made more sense to them and they could point to pieces and the words were there. So it wasn't X, Y, and Z. It was actual things being connected. And I really like what Sherry said about listening, giving students a chance to have some voice, um, to be able to be the teacher, to explain what they're doing is a terrific thing. And I know when I taught the systems modeling course and I was learning as I was teaching, my students would love teaching me things that they learned about that I didn't even know yet. And so it changes the relationship in the classroom. And it's really cool when teachers are receptive to students teaching them things or bringing insight into the classroom that they had not thought of themselves. So the teacher doesn't have to be the source of all information. I think we've really got to change that. It's changing, but not fast enough, and certainly not fast enough in math classes. Anyone,
Great,
Steve, you
thank
can
you.
ask another question, or anyone
Well,
else? Okay,
I'm just
Brad?
gonna make a quick comment, and all of you talked about this, but I don't think anyone was direct. Maybe Alan directly talked about it as well. But I hear in all of what you're saying that allowing kids to conceptualize in their own terms. So I mean, you do all of this kind of abstract stuff with drawings and stock and flow diagrams, but then you have conversations about them and what the meaning is to each of the kids, or what's the meaning of this graph. It shouldn't be straight, it should be curved, like you were saying. Allowing the kids to become involved in the conceptualization of what it is we're all talking about, I think, is a really important part of this as well. So conversation, when you're older, it's all verbal. When you're younger, it's very kinesthetic, but that social piece is so very important, I think.
Right. I agree. Thank you, Steve. Brad?
Hello to all three of you, and it's great to see all three of you again, and great job. Really appreciate this. I had a little bit. Some of you who don't know me, I'm a college professor, so I get people way later in their careers, and I will tell you that they have the same kind of problems that you're talking about right now. So there's nothing about getting older that makes it you more likely to be a systems thinker. In fact, maybe the opposite. I had a little bit of an aha moment when I was looking at your slides, Diane. And so this is a question for all three of you, but I'll sort of start it with Diana. It may be easier for this question to make sense if you share your slides, but I don't know if you want to do that. There's a slide that you had there that had a table of regular equations, and then the stock and flow structure, feedback structure next to it for how it would be represented in Stella. And this is one of those things that is so obvious in retrospect, but I have not had high school math for quite some time. So the equations that you show there all are time-dependent equations. The variable in those equations is the letter T for time. The equations that we're going to write when we write the Stella model do not ever include time. Right? That is actually except for the integral, right? And so they are causal relationships between two other variables. And so the question I'm getting at here, Diana, is I wonder if that is ever confusing to teachers because they're used to saying that there's going to be an equation that is describing, really, the time-based equation is describing the behavior, whereas what we're doing when we write our system dynamics model is we're writing equations for the causal structure that generates that behavior. That distinction is clear to everybody on this call. But I'm imagining that's something that would be very confusing to a teacher when they first start grappling with this. So what are the three of you's relative sort of experiences with that?
Hope that well, actually, it hasn't really come up to me to be a problem because the equation that is shown is an equation that relates the pattern of the stock behavior over time, right? The stock flow diagram has more involved that represents why that behavior is occurring the way it is. But the equation is just the behavior of the stock as time progresses. So it's a lot more limited. The stock flow gives you a bigger picture of the scenario. What I probably should have done was to take the equations and take out the x's. I don't know if I did that, and put in t's. But really, the equation represents just the stock behavior. It does not represent everything else.
Well, let me discourage you from doing what you just said you might want to do. Because if I see an equation in my level, if I see an equation with time in it, then I think that's exogenous behavior. And I think you're no longer really in the realm of systems thinking. So I want to encourage that the causal structure is within the boundary of what you're doing. And so I would discourage time-based behavior as the driver, so to speak. So, yeah. So I think what you did is probably right, is what I'm saying, based on
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So Alan or Sherry, did you want to, well, you probably don't do much with equations, either of you, right? Alan, you're a science teacher. You're more concerned with the actual behavior of the system when you're doing systems thinking.
Yeah, what I find one of the strengths of kids being exposed to stellar modeling is the connections between the stocks and the flows, which later in calculus, become integrating and differentiation. Which, when I was first taught that, in my day, that was something that I had as a freshman in appreciation for math because it was just too abstract for me. But had I had, some of the stellar modeling where I could see that the integration was the amount under the line and things like that, and the work that John Sturman and Linda Sweeney did, we in middle school found, kids took to that really, really quickly. And I don't have data that would show whether that helped them, understanding calculus or not, but it certainly helped me in retrospect to understand what some of those equations were doing that I just had to learn how to solve to pass a course, but I never really understood them.
I had a student tell me that the system dynamics really helped him understand calculus. So, because you're doing calculus, whether you like it or not, that's what's happening underneath the hood.
And also we very explicitly help teachers see the connection between some of the experiential things their students are doing and equations. And, we sometimes call sand table to algebra, like there's a continuum there, but not at a level of specificity that would address your question, Brad.
Right. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thanks. Yep.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, it seems like that's taken care of the questions and comments. So I want to thank you all very much for coming. And in our next SIG meeting next month we are going to build a peer bullying model with Pascal Gambardella and the beginnings of that. And then the month after that, we will talk about presentations are only an exposure vehicle. If you want to really help teachers take it into their classroom, mentoring is almost always required. And so we'll talk about the next stage, which is how do you help mentor teachers when they've seen this, they like it, they don't know how to make the transfer. So how do we actually help them as they are trying to do something with systems thinking or system dynamics in their classroom? Thank you for coming, and hope to see you again in a month when we talk about peer bullying. Okay.
Yeah,
bye.
thanks everybody. Thank you
you
so
all.
much.
Right.
Bye.